Right, well, what we're going to now tell you is the main points of the 2-week extension to the lockdown. This has been culled out of that very lengthy Home Ministry note, and it's long, but I'm going to read out some of the main points that we've been able to actually come up with, and then we'll find different ways of presenting that to you. But here are a couple of the main points that we have so far. So the extension of the lockdown for 2 weeks with effect from the 4th of May 2020. Let's keep scrolling up if we can. Then 100% coverage of Arogya Setu app among residents of containment zones. Containment zones must have intensified surveillance protocols with contact tracing, house-to-house surveillance, home and institutional quarantining of persons based on their risk assessment. Let's scroll that up if we can. What is not allowed across India, irrespective of the zone, is travel by air, by rail, metro, and interstate movement by road. Schools, colleges, and other educational and training and coaching institutions, hotels and restaurants, cinema halls, malls, gyms, sports complexes, social, political, cultural, and other places, kinds of gatherings, and religious places, places of worship for the public. So that is not allowed at all. Just scroll it on Q, please. However, movement of persons by air, rail, and road is allowed for select purposes and for the purposes as permitted by the Home Ministry. So that's something that needs to be spelled out. The movement of individuals for all non-essential activities shall remain strictly prohibited between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. So at night, this is not going to actually take place. In all zones, persons above 65 years of age, people with comorbidities, pregnant women and children below the age of 10 shall stay at home except for meeting essential requirements and for health purposes. Outpatient departments, OPDs, and medical clinics shall be permitted to operate in red, orange, and green zones with social distancing norms and other precautions. So that's important. However, these will not be permitted within the containment zones themselves. Now, as we've mentioned, there are green, red, and orange zones. So in the red zones, outside the containment zones, certain activities are prohibited in addition to those prohibited throughout the country. So what exactly are these? The plying of cycle rickshaws and auto rickshaws, the running of taxis and cab aggregators, intra-district and inter-district plying of buses, barber shops, spas and saloons, those are problematic areas. Certain other activities have been allowed in the red zones with restrictions. Movement of individuals and vehicles is allowed only for permitted activities with a maximum of 2 people besides the driver in 4-wheeler vehicles and with no pillion driver in the case of 2-wheelers. So only 1 person on a 2-wheeler. Industrial establishments in urban areas, in other words, special economic zones, export-oriented units, industrial estates, industrial townships with access control, these have all been permitted. The other industrial activities permitted are the manufacturing units of essential goods, including drugs, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, their raw material and intermediates, production units which require continuous process and their supply chain, the manufacturing of IT hardware, the jute industry with staggered shifts in social distancing, and the manufacturing units of packaging material. Now, construction activities in urban areas have been limited to in situ construction, in other words, where workers are available on site and no workers are required to be brought in from outside, and the construction of renewable energy projects is allowed. Shops in urban areas for non-essential goods are not allowed in malls, markets and market complexes, however, all standalone, in other words, single shops, neighborhood or colony shops and shops in residential complexes are permitted to remain home in urban areas without any distinction of essential and non-essential. E-commerce activities in the red zones are permitted only in respect of essential goods. Private offices can operate with up to 33% strength as per their requirement, with the remaining people working from home. All government offices shall function with senior officers of the level of Deputy Secretary and above at full strength, and the remaining staff attending up to 33% as per the requirement. However, defense and security services, health and family welfare, police, prisons, home guards, civil defense, fire and emergency services, disaster management and related services, the National Informatics Centre, Customs, the Food Corporation of India, the National Cadet Corps, the Nehru Yuva Kendra and municipal services shall function without any restrictions. Delivery of public services shall be ensured. Necessary staff will be deployed for such purposes. A large number of other activities are allowed in red zones. All industrial and construction activities in rural areas, including Manrega works, food processing units, brick kilns, are permitted. Besides, in rural areas without distinction to the nature of goods, all shops except shopping malls are permitted. All agriculture activities, in other words, sowing, harvesting, procurement, marketing operations in the agricultural chain are permitted. Animal husbandry activities are permitted, including inland and marine fisheries. All plantation activities are allowed, including their processing and marketing. All health services, including Ayush, are to remain functional, including transport of medical personnel and patients through air ambulances. A large part of the financial sector remains open. This includes banks, non-banking finance companies, insurance and capital market activities, credit and cooperative societies, operation of homes for children, senior citizens, destitutes, women, widows. Operation of Anganwadis has also been permitted. Public utilities, in other words, power, water, sanitation, waste management, telecommunications and the internet will remain open. Courier and postal services will be allowed to operate. Most commercial and private establishments have been allowed in the red zones. These include the print and electronic media, IT and IT-enabled services, data and call centers, cold storage and warehousing services, private security groups and facility management services, services provided by self-employed people except for barbers, etc., as mentioned earlier on. Manufacturing units of essential goods, including drugs, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, their raw material and intermediates, production units which require continuous process and their supply chain. This is all allowed. Jute industry with staggered shifts and social distancing, again allowed. Manufacturing of IT hardware and manufacturing units of packaging material will continue to be permitted. So those were in the red zones, where as is evident, a lot of things were permitted, but there are concerns on what is not permitted. Just for the benefit of our viewers, I think the point I need to mention before we go back to all of these points is this. The country has been divided into into red, orange and green zones. There are different requirements and rules for the red, orange and green zones. That's what we're trying to explain. It may appear confusing now, but essentially what's important to understand, in the red zones, in other words, areas where there are COVID cases, there are also containment zones. These containment zones continue to be restricted, and therefore what is allowed within containment zones remains essentially the same as what it is now. Food services delivered to your home, people not allowed to enter or to exit until areas are taken away from being containment zones. However, even in red zones, there are activities outside the containment zones which are permitted. That's what we've been trying to explain. The country also has orange zones, and in a few moments from now, I'll tell you about what is allowed in orange zones, and I will tell you later about what is allowed in green zones. So let's now return to what is allowed in the orange zones. In addition to activities which are permitted in the red zone, which I read out, taxis and cab aggregators will be permitted with one driver and one passenger only in orange zones. So inter-district movement of individuals and vehicles will be allowed for permitted activities only, in other words, essential services. Four-wheeler vehicles will have a maximum of 2 passengers besides the driver, and pillion riding will be allowed on two-wheelers. So pillion riding will be allowed, unlike in red zones. So that is the orange zone. In the green zones, all activities are permitted except the limited number of activities which are prohibited throughout the country, irrespective of the zone. In other words, as far as green zones are concerned in this country, in green zones, flights will not be permitted in this country. traveling from to other parts of the country will not be allowed in green zones as well. Let's go back to point number 12 if we can. Let's scroll back to point number 12 so that I can explain what exactly it is that I'm trying to talk about. Right. In the green zones, all activities are permitted except the limited number of activities which are prohibited throughout the country, irrespective of the zone. However, buses can operate with up to 50% seating capacity. Bus depots can operate with up to 50% capacity. All goods and traffic is to be permitted. No state or union territory shall stop the movement of the cargo for cross-land border trade under treaties with neighboring countries. No separate pass of any sort is needed for such movement, which is essential for maintaining the supply chain of goods and of services across the country during the lockdown period. All other activities will be permitted activities which are not specifically prohibited or which are permitted with restrictions in the various zones under these guidelines. However, states, union territories, based on their assessment of the situation and with the primary objective of keeping the spread of COVID in check, may allow only select activities from out of the permitted activities with such restrictions as felt necessary. So, in sum, what we are trying to say over here is this. There is the green zone where essentially everything is permitted other than a couple of areas which are not permitted of activity which is not permitted anywhere in the country. In fact, let's go back to point number 1 and I will try and tell you what activities are not permitted at all. Then apart from the green zone, there is the orange zone where there are certain number of activities which are in fact permitted beyond what exists in the red zone. Now, the red zone is where the large number of COVID hotspots in India do exist, but it is important to note the following, that in these COVID hotspots in the country, there are also containment zones, all right? So let's scroll back to the beginning of this if we can. Let's scroll back to the beginning if we can of this so that I can read out what is allowed. Right. So the extension of the lockdown is now for a period of 2 weeks with effect from the 4th of May. There are relaxations in the orange and green zones. 100% coverage of Arogya Setu, the app of the government, among residents of containment zones has been spelled out. Containment zones, this is where the COVID cases are, have to have intensified surveillance protocols. There has to be containment tracing, house-to-house surveillance, home institutional quarantining of people based on their risk assessment. Now, this is the point that I was trying to make, that irrespective of the zone you are in, what is not allowed across India, irrespective of the red zone, green zone or the orange zone, is the following. Travel by air, not allowed. Travel by rail, not allowed. By metro and interstate movement by road, not allowed. Schools, colleges are not being opened right now. Other educational and training and coaching institutions are not being opened. Hotels and restaurants not being allowed. Cinema halls not being allowed. Malls, gyms, sports complexes, etc. not being allowed. Social, political, cultural and other kinds of gatherings not being permitted. Religious places and places of worship for the public not open right now. However, movement of people by air, rail and road is allowed for select purposes, emergency cases, but these are spelled out strictly by the Ministry of Home Affairs. So the movement of individuals for all non-essential activities shall remain strictly prohibited between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. Now, that is the case for across the country. That 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., let's stay over there for a moment, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., it'll be the same, right? There will be no activity which will be permitted at night, across the night to 7 a.m. in the morning. Now, in all zones, persons above 65 years of age, people with comorbidities, in other words, those who've got other health conditions, pregnant women, children below the ages of 10, they should all be at home except for meeting essential requirements for health purposes. Now, everywhere outpatient departments in medical facilities, hospitals, medical clinics, these remain open. They'll be open in red, orange and green zones if you need to get to the hospital for anything. An OPD facility, you can do that. There will be social distancing norms, other safety precautions. However, these will not be permitted within the containment zone. So once again, this is the point that I keep repeating. And this point is the following. Again, people are confused because they're asking what is a hotspot and what is a containment zone. A hotspot is a larger area that has COVID cases, but within that hotspot are the containment zones across the country where particular areas have been completely sealed off, because in those particular areas there are individuals who are COVID positive and others who have been infected. So the permissions which are being granted, even in the hotspots which fall inside what are called the red zones, there are more permissions now, but there are certain things which have not changed at all. For example, air travel, which I have spelt out. Now, this is the point that I want to talk about next. In the red zones, outside the containment zones, where of course the COVID cases lie, certain activities are prohibited in addition to those prohibited outside the country. These are the plying of cycle rickshaws and auto rickshaws not allowed, the running of taxis and cab aggregators not allowed, intra-district and inter-district plying of buses not allowed, barber shops, spas, saloons not allowed in the red zones. All right. Certain other activities, however, have been allowed in the red zones, but with restrictions. Movement of individuals and vehicles is allowed only for permitted activities with a maximum of 2 people in addition to the driver in 4-wheel vehicles, and with no pillion driver in the cases of 2-wheelers. So if you are in a 2-wheeler, by which I mean a motorcycle or a scooter, you cannot have somebody in riding pillion. If you are in a car, then in addition to the driver, no more than 2 people are allowed. Again, I'm talking now about red zones, which see the largest number of cases of COVID-19 in this country. Industrial establishments in urban areas, in other words, special economic zones, export-oriented units, industrial estates and industrial townships with access control have been permitted even in the red zones. The other industrial activities permitted are the manufacturing units of essential goods, drugs, pharma, medical devices, their raw material, their intermediates, production units which require continuous process and their supply chain, manufacturing of IT, jute industry with staggered shifts and social distancing. So these are being allowed, and the manufacturing of packaging material. Construction activities in urban areas have been limited to in situ construction, where workers are available on site and no workers are required to be brought in from outside. Construction of renewable energy projects, that's being allowed. Shops in urban areas for non-essential goods are not allowed in malls, markets and market complexes. Again, I'm talking about red zones. However, all standalone shops, that's exactly what's happening now. Neighborhood colony shops and shops in residential complexes are permitted to remain open in urban areas, like what's happening now, without any distinction of essential and non-essential. E-commerce activities in the red zones are permitted only in respect of essential goods. An important point over here, just go back if you can. E-commerce is activities in the red zones are permitted only in respect of essential goods. There was a huge demand that non-essential goods be supplied on e-commerce through Flipkart, Amazon, you name it. That will not be allowed in red zones, so that the rules remain the same, only the supply of essential goods. Now, private offices and cars operating with up to 33% of their strength as per requirement, with the other people working from home, that is being allowed even in red zones. All government offices shall function with senior officers of the level of deputy secretary and above at full strength. Government officers are working, remaining staff attending up to 33% as per their requirement. Defence and security forces, health, family welfare, police, prison, home guard, civil defence, fire, emergency services, disaster management, related services, all that's working. The National Informatics Centre, the hub of the internet in the country, is working. Customs, the Food Corporation of India, the National Cadet Corps, the Nehru Yuvak Kendra, municipal services, they shall function without any restrictions across the country. The delivery of public services shall be ensured and necessary staff will be deployed for such purposes. A large number of other activities are allowed in the red zones. All industrial and construction activities in rural areas, including Manrega works. So we are now talking about red zones in rural parts of the country. So let's scroll back to the beginning of that point where I stopped. Yeah. So in rural areas, including Manrega works food processing units and brick kilns are permitted. Besides, in rural areas, without distinction to the nature of goods, all shops except in shopping malls are permitted. All agriculture activities, for example, sowing, harvesting, procurement and marketing operations, and we're talking about red zones in non-urban areas in the agricultural supply chain, are permitted. So additional permissions in red zones, but in non-urban areas is what I'm talking about here. Animal husbandry activities fully permitted, including inland and marine fisheries. All plantation activities are allowed, including their processing and marketing. All health services, including Ayush, must remain functional, including transport of medical personnel, people through air ambulances. A large part of the financial sector remains open. This is important. This includes banks, non-banking finance companies, insurance and capital market activities, and credit and cooperative societies. The operation of homes for children, senior citizens, destitutes, women, widows, operation of Anganwadis, this has been permitted. Public utilities, for example, in power, water, sanitation, waste management, telecommunications, internet, these remain open. Courier and postal services will be allowed to operate. What am I talking about over here? I'm talking about non-urban areas which may have a red zone. So that's what I'm talking about over here. Most of the commercial and private establishments have been allowed in the red zones. These include print and electronic media, IT-enabled services, data and call centers, cold storage and warehousing services, private security and facility management services, services provided by self-employed people, except for barbers, so you can't have your hair cut just yet. These have been allowed in red zones. Barbers not allowed. Okay. Manufacturing unit of essential goods, including drugs, pharma, medical devices, their raw material and intermediates, production units which require a process, their supply chain, jute industry with staggered shifts and social distancing, manufacturing of IT and manufacturing units of packaging material will continue to be permitted. So now I have spoken so far about the red zone. What I'm now going to tell you about is the orange zone, all right? So if you're confused, here's a small confession, so am I. But let's just carry on, take a look at the orange zone. In the orange zone, in addition to activities permitted in red zones, which I did read out, taxis, cab aggregators will be permitted with one driver and one passenger only. Inter-district movement of individuals and vehicles will be allowed for permitted activities only. Four-wheeler vehicles will have a maximum of 2 passengers. Besides the driver, and pillion riding will be allowed. So that was orange zones. And in green zones, all activities are permitted except the limited number of activities which are prohibited throughout the country. So no air travel, no interstate movement for non-essential purposes, train services, all of those that are not allowed over there. However, buses can operate with up to 50% seating capacity. Bus depots can operate with up to 50% capacity. So that's an important addition over there. All goods traffic is to be permitted. No state duty shall stop the movement of cargo for cross-border trade under treaties with neighboring countries. Again, we're talking only about green zones now. No separate pass of any sort is needed for such movement. That is essential for maintaining the supply chain of goods and services across India during the lockdown period. All other activities will be permitted activities which are not specifically prohibited or which are permitted with restrictions in various zones. So there you have it. A summary really of the main points. And I think the big takeaway from this for all of our viewers is there are green zones where there are no COVID cases, there are orange zones where there may be a very restricted number of cases, and there are red zones where there are COVID cases. However, in the red zones, there are containment zones. These containment zones, like right now, are completely restricted. There is no movement of people outside these containment zones. So those rules remain the same. However, within the red zones, there are certain activities which have been permitted, as we have spelt out. There are other activities which are not spelt out. So now we've actually tried to make it even simpler for you. These actually points will summarize it much better because it's a huge Home Ministry note. So let's talk about green activities. But let's see where this graphic starts. Activities in red zones. Private offices with 33% strength. This is allowed in a red zone. E-commerce, but only for essential items. This is allowed in red zones. I've gone through this point. Let's see what else we've managed to bring through in terms of allowed activities. All standalone shops, in other words, not malls, but standalone shops. A non-essential items sale is allowed, but only in standalone shops, not e-commerce. So standalone shops, that's very much the same as what we have now. Then there are orange zone activities where taxi services with curbs in areas where there are far fewer number of COVID cases. Inter-district movement is allowed, but only of essential services. And the taxi services you have are with curbs. So an inter-district movement, again, this is potentially misleading if you read it just like that, because you can't travel from one part of the country to the other for a holiday, for example, but it is allowed with some restrictions in orange zones for essential functions. Green zones, bus services are allowed, but with a 50% reduction in capacity. These are zones where there are no COVID cases. So bus services in green zones, bus services with 50% capacity. So that's a summary really of the main points in the green zones, the orange zones and the red zones where the large number of COVID cases in this country exist. So some restrictions and some changes, but the bottom line, for 2 weeks more, the extension in the lockdown has been extended. No schools, no colleges, no flights, no trains for normal purposes. People in containment zones remain. However, there is an opening up in a limited way of economic activity in companies, in even the red zones outside the containment areas. That's what we've tried to spell out. This will all be spelled out more clearly later on as well.